Well, thanks so much, and thanks again for this opportunity to share these films with you. So I know a number of you have been on the whole journey, have taken the whole ride from how do we get from Carmen Miranda to Selena, but in some ways, as I think the films all in some ways deal in different ways with the ways in which what we might call Latinidad, or the way in which Latinx or Latino identity has been legible in mainstream Hollywood cinema. This takes us roughly a period of 60 years. We go from, or not quite, a little bit less than 60 years, from the early 1940s to the late 1990s. So it gives us a glimpse into the 20th century mainstream vision of the way that mainstream cinema sort of was able to sort of imagine the dimensions of the lives and also the experiences and the histories of people we would today call Latinx or Hispanic. And part of the reason I wanted to, as I think I've mentioned in other contexts, in other conversations, when Chris approached me to do a film discussion, it occurred to me that I thought one of the things that some of you might have come in as we were talking a little bit about pedagogy and about what does pedagogy look like in this virtual moment. And one of the things that I have been invested in since March is been finding ways to leverage these opportunities to share what we do in the Princeton classroom and to share it outward with other publics. And so I've done a variety of things pedagogically over the last year or so to sort of find ways to sort of see how my students can be in conversation with folks outside of Princeton bubble, also how the work of what's going on in Princeton might be a resource available to others outside of the Princeton bubble. So when he approached me, I thought, oh, this is an interesting opportunity. I'm teaching a course this semester in Latinx musicals on stage and screen. Why not run a series of conversations that runs in tandem with my class? So in some ways, you're getting a version of what I've been teaching all semester, and that is why in some ways we might, if had that not been the case, we might not have had films that were so musically prominent, that in all of the films going from The Gang's All Here to West Side Story to Zoot Suit and to this one, the place of music is really central, like singing and dancing is really crucial. And then so if I hadn't been teaching a course on Latinx musicals, maybe we wouldn't have seen that so much. But then again, I think one of the crucial things about the presence of Latino bodies, narratives, and stories in mainstream Hollywood film is almost always those narratives include a lot of music, a lot of dancing. Like there is a way in which the ways in which the stories are told often do rely upon music in different ways. And one of the ways that I thought it was really interesting, I knew like there was a number of films that have come out in the last 40 or so years that have really focused on the lives of entertainers, the lives of music. Like some of you might be familiar with the film from 1987 called La Bamba. Others of you might have been cross paths with a film called El Cantante. These are films that talk about sort of notable Latino musicians. And so whether it be Richie Valens or Hector Lavoe, coming from different cultural traditions, there was also the Mambo Kings, the movie The Mambo Kings, which is more of a fictionalized story, but rooted in the idea of how music is a vehicle often for migration, for immigration, for economic transformation, economic mobility, how these kinds of stories sort of recur in the catalog of films about Latinidad. And yet I knew among the films that I was most interested in and most interested in thinking about a little bit more deeply was a film also about a Latino entertainer, biopic as it were, that was thinking about these questions of mobility, of migration, of immigration, these questions of legibility, cultural acceptance, cultural expression, cultural self-knowledge, and also really used music and used the catalog of a particular musical artist as a sort of a premise to sort of as a way into the story, whether you were already a fan, but by the end becoming a fan of a particular artist. And so I knew that Selena was interesting for me for all kinds of reasons. And I was very interested to return to the film. It is one of those films, and I'll use this as the end, and I'll open up for provocations, prompts, and conversation from the audience, from those assembled here. But it is one of those films. As I was watching it this weekend, it occurred to me there's a peculiar catalog of films that I've watched a million times. But I realize after I've watched, when I sit down to actually sit down and watch them, I realize I've very rarely seen the first 3 minutes of the movie. Because these are movies that I've watched a million times because my channel button pauses when I stumble upon them on cable. It's that moment like when I'm clicking through and there's a certain movie that hits and I'm just like, I'm going to stop and watch it now, which often means I don't see the first few minutes or the first 10 minutes or the first 20 minutes, but I'm an expert on the last 2/3. I've seen the last 2/3 1,000 times, but I haven't seen those first few as many times. And Selena is definitely one of those films, along with things like Any Willy Wonka that comes along, or Legally Blonde, you know, sort of a random assortment for me of the films that I will just sort of always stop and watch for ambient entertainment. But sitting into watching the movie from front to back with my full attention, I was really struck by how much this is, if not a musical, as we might understand it, in terms of a Rodgers and Hammerstein or a West Side Story style, where the characters sing their feelings, where the music offers a sense of interiority. This is not one of those musicals. But on another register, it is definitely a musical movie, a movie in which the music propels and guides the story, that the music does not arrive randomly. Every time we pause with the music, we're paused to ask about a juncture, to dig deep. And in some ways, we know more about Selena through her performances, because her performances help us understand all the other story parts that come along. And so in some ways, watching it from front to back, beginning and almost ending with the legendary performance of her at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo at the Astrodome, like where she was for 3 years running the highest capacity artist at this really important live entertainment venue annually. It was interesting to sort of see her. This is the number that we see her where she's wearing the iconic purple bodysuit, the purple sparkle bodysuit. And that is sort of the performance, the onstage performance that brackets most of the action of the film, that sets us up to appreciate the truncation and the tragedy of the loss. And I was really, again, struck by just how artfully Gregory Nava, the director, structured this, using the music as a way to sort of create the motion and the flow, and to allow the episodes, the characters, the stories, the backstories, all of those gossipy details, to allow those to fill in the gaps between the real appreciation of Selena as an artist, and then also as we revisit it now, as even we were talking about just at the beginning, is this was also the film that launched Jennifer Lopez into stardom. So this is this moment when we visit the film 23 or so years after its initial release, we're looking at it through these two registers about how this really did secure an appreciation of Selena as an enduring icon and artist, but it also launched the career of another icon and artist. And so there's a lot, I think, that this film opens for us to think about. And I'd be interested to know what this film caused you to think about. So I'll keep an eye out for hands. If you have a question or a comment or an observation, I'd welcome the opportunity for you to guide the conversation. Because what we'll be doing for the next 40 or so minutes is just having your thoughts or conversations guide how the conversation goes. Yeah, Craig. Let's see. Yeah, there you go.
Yes. So I thought it was a really interesting choice that how they started the movie, where she's singing 3 American songs. As I was kind of surprised by that, as opposed to going right into her Spanish type songs.
So did you like, yeah, it is an interesting choice, and as I think you named it, it is a choice. And did you have any additional thoughts or observations about the choice itself?
Well, the choice, yeah. Well, I was surprised that like 2 Donna Summer songs, Gloria Gaynor. I mean, very popular American. I mean, I think those would be the last 3 songs I would have thought would have started.
Well, and I think it opens up an interesting thread, right? It opens up the question of when she begins, and these are songs that she was part of her act, but I think it also opens up this question. One of the key questions of the film is, indeed, like one of the most iconic Tejano music stars of the later 20th century. We're going to a biopic, this sort of like this idea. The expectation is the first song would be either a traditional song or a contemporary Spanish pop song. And instead, what goes is from some of the most recognizable songs from the popular music catalog of the later 20th century. And what I think it opens up for us, just as we see the first time we see her father's band, Los Dinos, we also hear them singing a song out of the popular music catalog that's in English language song, and a recognizable one. I think what it really opens up for us is one of the core tensions that Gregory Nava uses to structure the story of Selena is really that structure of her on the hyphen between Mexican and American. This idea of life on the hyphen of the Mexican-American experience. And in fact, in some ways, that to understand only half of that also misunderstands the tension that anybody occupying the hyphen inhabits, like not fully, not understood, like as that one conversation with Abraham and AB and Selena in the car when they're talking about like, oh no, Mexico's right over there, but they don't accept us and they don't accept us over here. This sort of not like too American for the Mexicans and too a Mexican for the Americans. This, and I think what it's a very intentional moment, because on the one hand, there's no alienation for a presumptively non-familiar audience, right? So in some ways, the familiar music brings us into Selena, who is this person? I don't know this melody. There is something very captivating about watching a singer you don't know perform a melody you do know. And so in some ways that bridge of the familiar or the presumed familiar, how that bridges to an audience who may not be familiar with everything else. There is a whole other way for somebody who knows Selena, who comes in and knows that song. Like that's a whole part of her cat. That's why she's awesome. Like there's a kind of, when there's a familiarity already there, then they already meet to greet. But that's not necessarily who Gregory Nava, who's doing a mainstream cinema, a big sort of movie release, he's looking to bring in folks who don't know her yet. And so there's a kind of way that I think it's a very deft choice, because on the one hand, it brings an audience in, and also it announces one of the core tensions that really is in some ways the main tension of the film, separate from the biographical details of what happened to Selena, how she became famous and how she died. The film is almost unconcerned with those details, but the film is really interested in these questions of self-determination, of how one presents oneself, and how one presents oneself as a Mexican, as an American, as a young woman, as a person who is both traditional and also reaching beyond the norm, like sort of pushing against those norms of the traditional upbringing. A lot of these, that's really at the core of the story, is these questions of identity and the questions of how one expresses one's identity. And I think the opening, because of course, one of the things is we see Selena, this was one of the things that struck me when I was looking at the first 3 minutes of the film, was I had totally forgotten that the opening character beat we see of Selena is her being behind and doesn't know where her costume is. Whether or not that is plausible or believable, what it does open up is that she actually crafted the self that then she presents so marvelously on stage. That she is in some ways responsible for the person she was when she had her most triumphant stage performance, and what ended up being the final major triumph of her stage career, that she, in all of her idiosyncrasy, crafted that performance. And so there's a way in which we see her making herself up and taking the stage and becoming, and then we shoot back where Jennifer Lopez disappears and we see the little girl and we see all of this. But there's a very deft way that opening sequence introduces almost all the guiding tensions of what the film is going to be exploring, in no small part because it starts with a song that folks might not expect to be the song that begins a film if they've only read the blurb. So it's a great way to sort of think about, it's a perfect thing to notice the paradox of. Thanks, Craig. So Elise? Yeah, Elise? You're not on mute yet. You've got to unmute yourself first. Okay. There we go.
There we go. I'm glad that scene of in the car with Edward James Olmos, relieving himself of this passionate speech. I'm glad that came up early, because I found that to be like one of the central scenes of the movie, obviously. But I felt that it was almost as if the screenwriter was telling us and not showing us. Because in fact, I didn't see, other than the early, 1961 thing with the original Latinos and the way they were rejected, it didn't seem like there was much bias against Mexicans in where they were living. All the neighborhood kids were playing together. It was like a rainbow coalition of what have you. And when they later went down to Mexico, which had triggered all of her father's fears and tensions, in fact, she was broadly accepted. She wasn't rejected as a Mexican American. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, two things. One is, I think what that also names uh, is the sort of the fact of generational trauma, the fact of intergenerational trauma shaping some of these narratives, the fact that what the kids are experiencing, and he's made a lot of choices to protect them from the trauma of the world, and he wants to sort of then. So there's a lot of thread in that in terms of what our parents believe about identity and what we believe about identity may be different because of our different historical locations. You know, you might have a lot of experiences in your own lives of how a parent might say, you can't go out wearing that, everyone will think this thing of you, and that is drawing from a different time of cultural, thinking about like tattoos, for example, like different generational responses to tattoos of what they would mean and the consequences they would have for your life. And that is some of the ways in which I think that works. On the other hand, um, it sets up the tension, and it sets up one of the Selena's most notable victories in the story of her as being separate from her father, of her knowing how to do things her father didn't know how to do, is the fact that she understood from his teaching that there would be a way in which the fact that they weren't Mexican enough was going to be a bias that she was going to have to negotiate. She understood that, and then she said, remember when she's walking into that big event and then the sketchy promoter is saying, I can't believe she doesn't speak Spanish that well, you have to do all the talking, you know. And so she's going like, don't worry, Dad, I got this. And what she does is what she knows she can do. She can have a connection with everybody. And so what she does is she does that thing which is unscripted. She doesn't go to the dais. She instead goes and greets every member of the Mexican media, and we see that extended sequence where she's greeting everybody, saying hello, smiling, laughing, saying hello, complimenting, etc. And so then when she goes up and is like, I can't finish my thought in Spanish and I'm going to finish it in English, it's cute rather than a failure because she's introduced herself already. And that's something that Abraham would have not thought to do. Or that's something that Selena, just as she has the instinct in the next scene, after they go to the outdoor concert where again the sketchy promoter has not created the appropriate safety protocols for the performance, where she goes out there and there are 10 times as many people there, and the security's not in place, and the rigging is already under par, and all this stuff, and it's a pretty traumatic, it's a near traumatic incident, and they stop the performance, and then he says, you have to go back out there. Do you know can you do it? And she says, yes, I can. So she does what he asks. But then the next thing she does is she turns to AB and she says, let's do this song and slow it down. So in some ways, she knows what her father has set her up to do, but her genius, her artistry, her vision, her brilliance goes beyond what her father has given her. So in some ways, what we're seeing always in here is how what Abraham wants for her is one thing, but what she knows she can do is beyond what Abraham wants for her. And there's that way that scene really does encapsulate that both in the forward and the back. It names that aspect of generational trauma that really guides that she is healing his own generational trauma. She is healing, her success is healing the generational trauma he has had as an artist and as a Mexican American. And that she is moving in this other mode of confident crossing over that is, if not solving the problems, but offering a new way of inhabiting them. And so I think it is, I would not say that this is the most sophisticated screenplay. And I think there is a lot of showing, a lot of telling and not showing in the screenplay. But I do think that's often the case in a biopic where these are didactic moments or moments of distillation, where the moments are not so much about nuance, but more about making sharing an insight, sort of giving a glimpse into this aspect of this person. And so I don't disagree with your assessment of this as being a sort of a funny moment, a little oddly didactic section of the story. But I think it's put there in a very intentional way because, and also if you're familiar with the work of Gregory Nava, the filmmaker, he directed the film Mi Familia. He was also behind the PBS series, or ABC and then PBS series, American Family. These are the questions that really guide him and that guide a good cohort, a good part of the cohort, including Luis Valdez, about sort of this cohort. And one of the producers of this film is Moctezuma Esparza, who is a key figure in Chicano media. And they really did grapple in the 70s with being rejected as pocho or sort of culturally incompetent by Mexican critics and stuff like that. So there is a kind of way in which this is sort of trying to name the specificity of life on the hyphen for the Mexican American artist. and to talk about the particular tensions for those who might not have experienced it, and especially for somebody like Selena, who is growing up in a multicultural American society, even though she's mostly living with her family. It's that she's got a different set of references than her father did and her mother. And so, because as we hear the little glimpse of her mother's backstory, her mother's they're one, like there's a mobility story that they're struggling to make, and it's one step removed from pretty scrappy poverty. And so so there's a sense in which, but the kids are sort of living a sort of a pretty American life, but it's an American life in a Mexican American enclave. So there's a kind of tension that they don't have the insight for. And so I do think it's interesting also just to note Edward James Olmos. This is 15 years later. And it's again part of his, from Zoot Suit. This is about 13, it's about 15 years later since that film, 17 years later. But it's again part of his capacity to transform himself, that there are plenty of folks who see Zoot Suit and Selena and have to be reminded of the connection between Edward James Olmos in both films, because he physically doesn't look the same. He is not nearly as suave, not nearly as debonair in this role, and that's because he is very that's part of his capacity as an actor, is distinctive as he is vocally and as distinctive as he is as a visual presence. He also is a very transformational actor. He really transforms into the characters he plays in a way that not every actor with as distinctive a face and distinctive a voice actually can do the kind of transformation that he does. So there's something I always find it quite amusing that to think about the many Olmoses we've seen over the years. And even in the course of this series, the many Olmoses we've seen in this series. Erika, did you have?
Yeah, two things. One that you just was talking about Olmos. The other thing is Lupe Ontiveros is also in both Zoot Suit and also in Selena playing a very different role. But what I was going to ask is originally is, can you talk a bit about some of the drama about Nava and Esparza even casting Lopez as Selena, please?
Well, I mean, there's two things. There's like the mention. So I think I'm glad you reminded me of mentioning the great, one of the great actors of Chicano theater and of the sort of one of the great Latina actors of screen of all time is Lupe Ontiveros. Lupe Ontiveros played Yolanda Saldivar, the villainess in this film, the villainous murderer of the fan club president. She also played the mother in Zoot Suit. She played, so she's the same. She played the mother, and she is one of the stalwarts of the Chicano theater tradition. She also played the maid in Goonies. I mean, she's once you do her bio, you realize how many movies she's been, often playing mothers and maids, but also like in a movie like Chuck and Buck, like an extraordinary, and a movie like Real Women Have Curves, an extraordinarily complex and deep actor in any role she's in, even if she's only in a few scenes playing a really sort of thankless depiction of a really a fascinating human in the story. Yolanda Saldivar is a really complicated figure, and this film is not interested in Yolanda. But Ontiveros brings an incredible humanity to the part in only about 5 scenes. And so that's just sort of the first part of Erika's comment. The next part of Erika's comment opens up this question that is one of the questions that continues to, there's some mystery to it. What Erika is naming is there was a great deal of controversy when the casting was announced of Jennifer Lopez, who is Boricua, New Rican, Puerto Rican from the Bronx, all these things, playing an iconic Mexican American. And this is after the production had done a huge casting search, what they promoted as being the second largest casting search for in Hollywood history, sort of comparing the casting of Selena to the casting of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. You know, this sort of huge publicity sort of seeking. And from that casting search, they actually did yield the young actress whose name I didn't write down, and I apologize, but the young actress who played young Selena was actually identified in this enormous casting swoop, mostly in South Texas, but also in California, where they really sought out the Mexican American community. And there was a sort of a sense of, our story is going to be told. And there was a sense of betrayal that emerged immediately when the character was played not by a Mexican American actor, not by somebody yielded from the Star Search, but in some ways a sort of a rising Hollywood property, a rising person who's been in the entertainment industry for about 6 or 8 years, Jennifer Lopez from New York. So there was a controversy that erupted around cultural authenticity and about whether there was appropriation and all of this. And then behind the scenes, of course, Jennifer Lopez's first major film role was in a small role as the mother in Mi Familia, in My Family, Gregory Nava's first big film. Like, she's one of the most extraordinary performances of her career is her first on screen, when she's trying to protect the boy child as she has been deported, just rounded up in the streets while in the market, while pregnant. And so she ends up being transported back to central Mexico. This is a historical account set in the 1940s, which was not uncommon for this kind of just rounding people up and then dropping off in a home country, whether or not the home country was actually their country. And so it's a really, Mi Familia, Gregory Nava is a really remarkable film. And Jennifer Lopez has a small part, but it's an extraordinary part. And that Gregory Nava knew Jennifer Lopez and knew of her capacity as an actor, even though most people only knew Jennifer Lopez as a dancer from the television comedy series In Living Color. So she was a fly girl on the television comedy series In Living Color, and was known at this time only as a dancer who sometimes acted. And so, when Jennifer Lopez was cast, it opened up some really interesting questions about some of the questions we've talked about in different contexts, of just the question of intra-Latino casting, cross-cultural casting, the way that it's often in the American cinema, how all they need to be is Latino. They don't have to be the right kind of Latino, they just need to be a Latino. This idea of, and that's something that when we pull, not so much the films in this series, because most of those actors are actually Chicano, but if you look at other films like La Bamba, or other films that we might see from the last 30 or so years, often there's a lot of Puerto Rican actors playing Mexican characters, Cuban actors, or Colombian actors, or Venezuelan actors, this mix of ethnicities playing the American ethnicity Latino, this mix of different national origins in the American ethnicity. So there is, I think, what was striking to me was there was 2 waves of controversy around the casting of Jennifer Lopez as Selena. One was when the announcement was happening, and there was a sense of betrayal. There was a sense of two Chicanos cast a Puerto Rican, and that's a betrayal and a disrespect to Chicana Mexican-American actors. And that was one wave that also contributed to the publicity, just as the whole casting stunt was about publicity. There was another wave upon release, where when the film was released, there was another wave of critique. But both of those waves of critique were not erased or evacuated, but they were sort of short-lived, because the film ended up tapping into a sense of goodwill that ended up being always in contradistinction. There was something about the fact that Jennifer Lopez was a great Selena that complicated. And indeed, like what we see in a lot of media coverage of the time, is there's a lot of effort drawn to the fact that what perfect casting Jennifer Lopez was, how she was able to put on Selena's clothes and they fit her almost perfectly. These kinds of things, of the way that they didn't have to do much makeup adjustment. They didn't have to, even though her eyes are much bigger, there was not much else that they had to make, any kind of thing, and that they caught her spirit. And so there was a kind of way where there was a lot of marketing that went in balance with this, to say that there is sort of, and then because Jennifer Lopez is so effervescent and so charismatic and so effective in the role, especially in the fact that the role really does rely upon a physical embodiment of Selena, and how much of what the choreographer and Jennifer Lopez did together is really found ways to replicate her physicality. So there was a way in which she was recognizable as Selena, separate from the biographical. So there was a way in which there was a pleasure that even the naysayers ended up like, there was a respectful interpretation of the part. And so I think that that's always the question that comes up, is a lot of the anxieties about authenticity and casting have a lot to do with that anxiety of erasure and disrespect. And so I think in this case, they they leveraged the production apparatus to make sure that Selena's story was respected. And of course, the family, who has been a very proprietary and very controlling and very invested in the Selena narrative, they were fully throated in the support of Jennifer Lopez in the role and worked closely with her. So there was a kind of way where the production forces rallied in support of the decision to cast Jennifer, and that ended up meaning the grassroots critiques had a hard time sticking and lasting. There was an interesting article that by Francis Aparicio that was written. A couple scholars have engaged it as this, but given how hot the controversy was at the time, it's amazing how it has been as Selena has become a sort of a pan-Latino icon. There's been a way in which Selena has become not just a Mexican-American icon, but sort of where like drag performances of Selena will be happening anywhere there's a Latino community, so like all over, and so there's a way in which Selena's sort of still South Texas, still Tejano, but also she belongs to everybody in a way now. And in some ways there is an argument that Jennifer Lopez, the connection of the two of them amplified that transition. And so it's an interesting question that always I keep waiting for it to erupt again. But even there's even in the film's 20th anniversary, there's a really interesting interview on the Today Show with Jennifer Lopez talking about the film, where she actually started performing Selena's songs in her own voice, and talked about how how she feels their collaboration had continued, and that Selena was one of her greatest teachers. There's a really interesting ongoing story there that I find just the connection of J-Lo and Selena really fascinating. Catherine, you had a thought?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks for pointing out that Edward James Olmos and Lupe Ontiveros are in this. Definitely missed both of them.
Well, you notice their characters, but their actorliness disappeared them. Yeah.
Exactly, which is all credit to them for that. So two things. One is that I felt that the film sometimes lacked a progression, and this happens in biopics because you have to pick and choose, but it was like she was playing at fairs and then she won a Grammy. And you really missed a lot of that in between part. I wonder what if looking back on it, it's still 2 hours long, so it's not that short necessarily, but what you would include or exclude from the film. You mentioned her dancing. I would have actually liked to have seen more of J-Lo dancing as Selena, for instance. And then the second part is, there's just still so much remembering Selena. There's the new Netflix series that you mentioned last time that's coming out. Why, you started to touch on it at the end, but why do you think she's become such an inspirational and like ubiquitous figure over the past 20, 30 years?
Well, I do think it's because the film was in rotation constantly. I do think it is also, and it's also one of the rare, there haven't been a lot of Latina princess stories, and many princess stories don't end happily or don't end like they end, like, so it's an interesting moment of possibility. So I do think there's something about how few stories about young Latinas have been really at the center that are not about interfamilial conflict. Like there's just something about her as a very like how many other Latinas were there dolls made from, like this kind of appeal. And the fact that this is sort of an all family story, and it is a story of a young girl coming of age, like that's not a bustier, that's a bra. This kind of these kinds of moments are very much about sort of young girl coming of age, a young girl finding her dreams, living her truth, and sort of having these loves and being them and bringing the bad boy back. Like there's a lot of very simple, iconic sort of ways of sharing the idealized version of a young woman, even though and indeed the film doesn't spend a lot of time with the tragedy. And there's no courtroom drama. There's no, like a lot of the other materials, like there's been a lot of sort of 2020 or Dateline kind of interviews with Yolanda and those kind of things. Like those things recur periodically, but the story of Selena, I think, has really, it gave a different kind of icon right at the time when that kind of icon was especially ready. And then J-Lo, it also launched Jennifer Lopez. So there's those kind of things. I do think I would be much more interested in a less patriarchal vision of Selena, a vision of Selena that wasn't as much defined by dad and boyfriend and those kind of things. Also, I think one of the things that's very interesting is, you know, because she won a niche Grammy. She was not on the nighttime Grammy broadcast. She was in one of the other categories of the. So that's not. I mean, I think one of the great things about it is she won a Grammy, and that was an important benchmark of her success. But also just a cultural literacy thing is the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo is one of the biggest live performance venues in the United States, even though it's a rodeo and they're in like dirt. It's one of the biggest venues. So it's like a month long in Houston, some of the biggest acts, 70,000 people. And it's an annual thing for genre artists, like Beyonce's played there. You know, it's this kind of thing where it's like it's a mix of genres now. It's not just country and Tejano, but there is Tejano night. And for most of the last 30 years, her performances were the highest capacity sales for that venue. So it is this question of just because you haven't heard of her doesn't mean she's not important. There's that thread of that. And I do think that there is also not a lot of extant material, because she worked in a moment like her story happened 20 years later, there would have been a whole lot more cell phone footage. There would have been a whole lot more footage of her. But what we have is local television, home video. Like you saw that honking home video camera, like the home video camera. Remember that, like that Suzette is holding on her thing, which is like the size of a giant suitcase. Like, and we just think about how recently that was. How like this is sort of my era, where like I went to college and there's next to no pictures of my life in college because like but now as folks who went to college have pictures of all the time, like there's pictures everywhere. So I do think there's an interesting way where her stage performances, almost all of the ones that are known footage of are in some ways called out to in this film. So I do think even though it was part of her live performance and live performance presence, there's not much more. But I do think in answer to the first part of your question, I think I would love to have seen a little bit more. And I'm curious to see on the trailer for the Netflix series, with just if you're interested, the trailer does not, the teaser for the Netflix series does not suggest there's going to be a whole lot, that this just going to be more of the story. It doesn't seem like it's a different story. It seems like it's more of the same story, but that could just be the trailer. It's hard to know. But and it drops in about 2 weeks on Netflix. The series does. So, but I'm not. It's a big question. And indeed, when the series one spin in my social media, there's a lot of comment of like, why do we keep telling Selena's story? Aren't there other stories we can tell? But the family has a very proprietary interest in maintaining the value of her story. Her story anchors their recording. They're now sort of like recording. A little bit of like AB, the brother, has sort of a recording studio. Their museum in Corpus is a remarkable place, but it's all still very family owned, and it's very much family, not unlike Graceland was for a long time. It's very much sort of a family monument. And so if you are in Corpus, I would, if you do find yourself in Corpus Christi, Texas, I made a pilgrimage there when I was in Austin for a year. I said, I have to go see my family and I have to go see Selena. So I did a trip down through Corpus to Brownsville. But the Selena Museum is quite remarkable and quite modest at the same time, which I think is also a really interesting paradox of what you're talking about. Her stardom was never major, but her stardom mattered to those to whom it mattered. And when she died, her stardom expanded. And that's, I think, that legendary scene that is sort of the pretty woman moment, the salesgirl shaming moment, that sort of sequence, the way that both plays with those questions of class and legibility, but it also activates it through a lens of they might not know who she is, but other people right next to them do. This sort of question of cultural legibility of who is an important figure, and how there is a sense in that, how like the niching of like she was a big star, even though most people in America didn't know who she was. And that sort of paradox is also part of the story, because she was also, the tragedy of her is, you know, she was like in, you know, early 20s, 23, 24. She had just recorded her first fully English language album, even though she'd been performing in both English and Spanish for a couple of years. She had also recorded an important track on a West Side Story tribute album where she sings a cover of a Boy Like That, a Boy Like That, the song that Anita sings. And it's a really interesting sort of early 90s New Jack remix of that song. She was just on the point, she had made an appearance in a major film starring Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando, where she had a sort of a cameo role. She was just on the verge of what the American entertainment industry would call crossing over. She was set to make a major crossover impact, and this idea of being the next, and so it's an interesting sort of question of passing the baton. Did Selena pass the baton to Jennifer Lopez? Because in some ways, the career that Jennifer Lopez had in some ways was the career that Selena was sort of being set up to have as well. And so would there have been room for both? Would J-Lo have happened if Selena hadn't died? What would have happened to Selena? Would she just had a bunch of kids and remained a sort of a niche celebrity? We don't know, but there is this kind of interesting juncture there in terms of the hunger for iconic celebrities for brown girls, you know. There's also an interesting documentary, I'm not sure how accessible it is these days, called Corpus, a home movie for Selena, which my students watched this week by a lesbian independent filmmaker named Lourdes Portillo. And it explores the phenomenon of fandom. And it was made at the same time that this film was made. So it's an interesting parallel documentation of the reverberations of why Selena mattered to the people to whom she mattered before this film was released.
Could you mention that again? What was the name of that?
It's called Corpus. A home movie for Selena. It may be available through Canopy or similar platforms. It is so if you have access to Canopy, it may be access because it's released through Women Make Movies and also POV. So that sometimes it was distributed on PBS through the POV series. So between Women Make Movies and PBS POV, there may be ways of accessing it. It's about 50 minutes long, and it's really quite remarkable in the way that it reckons with the many meanings of Selena, even before the film, even before all of the other tribute shows, even before, I keep waiting for somebody to make a stage musical about her life, but that hasn't quite happened yet. So somebody from the Singer household?
Yeah, there was some reference made in the movie about Gloria Estefan.
Yeah.
What was the relationship there? Was Selena gearing into or looking at her in a very positive way as an icon?
Well, I think what we see in that is the people who make that mention are record executives, the record executives from the major labels who are beginning to think about Selena as being the next Gloria Estefan. And indeed, Gloria Estefan had her breakout happen about 10 years prior. So in some ways, it's this idea of whose pathway is being followed here. And I do think if you happen to have the opportunity to see if a touring production comes back around, or if you have the opportunity to see On Your Feet, the Broadway musical called On Your Feet, the story of Emilio and Gloria Estefan, there's a sort of a remarkably similar kind of trajectory where they are being both recognized and misrecognized by the industry. And so it's sort of I think an in-joke of like, oh yeah, we don't know who you are and you're awesome all on your own, but only lens we have for you is the Gloria Estefan box. So we can pitch you as being the next Gloria Estefan, because again, in 10 years prior, Gloria Estefan had been the last major Latino music crossover with The Rhythm Is Gonna Get You, and Miami Sound Machine sort of was a crossover hit, performing well in both the Latin music market as well as the pop market. And that's sort of the niche that Ricky Martin was in with Menudo, and then later as a solo artist. It's this question of the crossover is, and indeed the crossing over metaphor is a key metaphor for this film, because what we have is this moment of this star rising who's just about to do this pinnacle moment for any Latino star, is to cross over into another market outside of the niche. And so it's this idea, this industry term of crossover. But crossover also opens up this question of crossing the border, of crossing over over on which way and which way are you crossing over. And then finally, because this is a hagiography, a story of a star who died before their time, it's also about crossing over to the next realm, to the realm of the mystical, the superstardom, or to the other realm beyond life. So there's this way in which the crossover as a structuring premise is really one of the key questions of reaching for crossover. What are we reaching for when we do? And so that idea of crossing over is something that overdetermined the legibility of Latino celebrity in the 1990s into the early 2000s. But I also think Nava is sophisticated to that, which is why I think we have that side reference that's a little bit snarky, a little bit sort of like it's unclear what's going on there, as you asked. You know, it's like, are they in competition? Did they know each other? I don't know if they know each other. I suspect that they didn't, because Gloria Estefan was major and Selena was rising. But it's notable that that's the frame that the executives from the record company can use. And we notice in that pairing, and if you happen to see the film again, it's a Latino and an Anglo who are in that conversation. So it's this mix already in the sort of the executives. It's a Latino and a non-Latino, you know, and so there's this way, and that's something that comes up a lot. And it's like if you encounter La Bamba, it comes up too. And this has to do with the question of how will I have to change? And I do think the film, as Craig's question tipped us off at the beginning of this conversation, Craig's question reminded us that Nava is saying that there's no compromise to her authenticity when she becomes a star in the American market, because she was as American as she was Tejano. That there's a way that he's setting it up. It's not a battle over authenticity for her. Selena's authenticity held both. And that is in some ways the argument that is a little bit different in this film, because like that's something that in La Bamba they struggle with, but also in El Cantante they struggle with. El Cantante also stars Jennifer Lopez in what I think is one of her most important film performances. But it's an interesting tension, and the sort of I love in like whether it's That Thing You Do, that boy band musical that Tom Hanks made, like the way that record executives always show up, they're always this force of like Almost Famous, same thing, like record executives exist always in a weird kind of like the man, evil, but that's a very 20th century vision of them, because of course the record industry, once the 21st century started, the record industry went into chaos and disarray. But at this moment, the king-making aspect of a record industry attention is still very much at play. And I think that side reference is, again, I think Nava is very sophisticated and about what he's choosing to present and doing a very kind of broad shorthand. It's not about nuance, but it's not without intention. There's not a lot of, it's not subtle, but it's very specifically and very carefully done. You know, just like the casting of the women in the boutique, like these kinds of very specific choices being made.
Brandon had a comment.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it was sort of related to that. I mean, it just seemed like, the crossover was always the goal, and that was success. And the Latinos, the original Latinos failed because they didn't cross over and weren't allowed to sing their English songs. And this was just always the goal. And there wasn't a lot of conflict around that. And it's obviously different than what we saw in previous movies, where there's a little bit more conflict around the assimilation or, the relationship between the majority class. And I just wondered if that was a function of, people recognizing that the music industry, if you want to make money and be in a large market, you go to the English language, or if it was a sign of shifting times and shifting, cultural goals, given that, Selena did occur in the 1990s and the other movies that we saw were earlier.
Well, and I think, and even Los Dinos, because the paradox with Los Dinos is they really fail in the crossing over. Like they say, well, at least when you go to this one, they're going to like you. And of course, the Mexican band hates them even more. Just it's so I do think that there's two things going on here in terms of the exceptionalism of Selena that's being offered. Is on the one hand, it's a generational thing, like we're further along, and sort of the idea of assimilation, progress, and in some ways, not so much assimilation, but cultural hybridity of sort of being able to be both and not having to choose either or. And I think Selena is being offered as somebody who is raised to only know American music, to sing memories, to sort of sing feelings, like the songs that she's singing are not necessarily, she has to be taught cumbias intentionally. She has to learn how to sing certain songs. And And so, but there's a way in which that her parents over assimilated her in what was not an uncommon parental thing of saying, it was trauma, like we came from poverty, so we're going to go to a white neighborhood, we're going to sort of make sure our kids are becoming American and all this kind of stuff. And then a sort of a recorrection, which is very much 1990s, very much 1980s and 1990s, of really trying to say that, no, we are US, we are American, but we are also American Americas. We are of the hemisphere too, like this sort of finding a way to hold the both together. And so I think on the one hand, that is part, and if you look at Nava's work, that is definitely one of his investments of trying to get away from a polarized and going to sort of more a syncretic, more sort of a bicultural or a cultural hybridity, which is very 1990s, very 1990s. On the other hand, I think Selena is presented in this film and in the hagiography of the narratives that are authorized by the Quintanilla family as being special, as being something that is somebody who is beyond category, of somebody who exceeds everything. So on the one hand, it's both got that cultural angle on it, but it's also got this kind of star, like ineffable, like sort of the beloved celebrity, like the iconic ones who died too young, like whether it's Buddy Holly or James Dean or Marilyn Monroe or Selena. It's these figures who never had to grow old and could stay in the potential of all that was before them. And there's something that also in that is that she was beyond any limitations put on her. She could make it work. She could eat junk food and stay skinny. She could, like there's all these things that she was presented as being special. And I think that that's a part of what the movie's invested in. I think that connects to the way that even though she doesn't live a princess life or have a princess story, there's a way in which her magic, the magic of Selena is, I think, part of what leads to the compelling, like why she does sort of exist as a kind of a Tejana princess in a really interesting and complicated way, but still it's there. And then also, in one of my favorite details in the movie of Corpus, the movie I mentioned, there's the noted Chicana writer, Sandra Cisneros, is talking about how she doesn't really care about Selena, like she's doing her Sandra Cisneros thing, but she talks about she bought a keychain at the gas station because it's the only time she'd ever seen a keychain at a gas station with a Chicana on it, other than the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so she said, I was going to have to buy it because it was a Chicana on a keychain. Like, when do you see that? And so there's this element of her being something that is like in that way, like she has what sometimes we might call, she has it, she's a star, she's special. Whether or not that would have been true had she not died, I don't know. But there's something about, this is one of the things the film is invested in. Not only is she capable of exceeding the limits of cultural boundaries and the cultural limitations, but she's also a rising star. And that's indeed her logo now, is a star, is a shooting star. In addition to a butterfly, like Dolly Parton. So I think we have time for one last question. I think, Craig, you had a thought. Is that, you can close this out too?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Tejano music in general, because I thought that was something I didn't know a lot about. And when I read up on it, it was interesting to me that it has a lot of European influences, like polka and German music. And it struck me that it seemed like a perfect style for her as a way to bridge the two cultures.
Well, totally. And it's like conjunto music or Tejano music. It's a lot of sounds that you would recognize from polka, from country music, from certain kinds of, and also certain kinds of mariachi or norteño style, like sort of sounds. So it's definitely a cultural hybrid music that uses instruments like the accordion, uses instruments that electric amplification, a lot of things that are borrowing from rock and roll, from country, some blues, and it's also a party music. It's a music that's about coming together to dance and to party, to play loud on your radio, to sort of have the kind of dance party in the fields where everybody pulls their trucks together in a circle, turns on their headlights and creates a dance field in there by tuning the radio to the same station and creating your own dance party. So there is a kind of way that it's a convivial dance, it's a party dance, it's a dance that's about love, it's got a lot of the narratives of broken hearts and loves, like all banal pop music does, but it sings to the soul in a certain way. And it also has a kind of cultural pride. But conjunto music and is the sound of the border is one that does draw from the fact of this cultural hybridity of, and it also that informs some of the Tex-Mex cuisine in certain ways in terms of, but also the very idiosyncratic migration patterns of South Texas with Poles and with Polish and German. And there's like certain pastries that are very much about cultural hybridity and all of these kind of things. So I think that in some ways was the market. And had she grown up in Los Angeles, it probably it would have been a different market. Had she grown up in New Mexico, it might have been a different market. Had she grown up in Chicago, it might have been a different sound. There was a sense in some ways that they, as we saw, in the very first act they got when Abraham leveraged his old agent saying, I don't know, they're kids, they've got a good act. They're up there in a sort of carnival bandstand singing Feelings, I think, and nobody's paying attention. And then out comes a conjunto, a Tejano band, and everybody's on the floor dancing. And that's Abraham sort of responding to the market and learning and leaning into the market and bringing in the expertise. But then, of course, when Chris Perez, her ultimate husband, comes in, they want to bring that contemporary sound, that electrified sound, that sound of the contemporary. So there's always a sense of, it's not necessarily traditional music, just like salsa is not necessarily traditional music. It's a popular form that has an intergenerational appeal, which is not necessarily, we don't have a lot of analogs for that in the American musical landscape in terms of popular music. So there is a lot, I think, it's Selena's story is very much about the fact of the top 40 American sound, and then the sound at the parties and at the bandas and the carnivals and the festivals around her. So it's really in that hybridity. So I think with that, I think I'm going to sort of say thank you to everybody for joining the conversation over these last few weeks, because it's been a treat to sort of think and talk about some of my favorite films with all of you. And I do hope that you continue in your support of Garden Theater, and because I do think that they are such an invaluable and important resource for the Princeton community, and wherever Renew Theater is part of your life. I think, I know it's tricky and I know it's hard, but please encourage those around you just to help support these cultural institutions, which make our community so valuable. And it's been a pleasure to be a part of that effort and to join in community with you, albeit separated by this virtual realm. So until next time, I'm sure I'll be back hosting films again. Maybe we'll use this format in the future. I think there is value to this format, Chris. I would agree. And until next time.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor.
you
It's
so
been
much.
great.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
It's great.